Latanya dragged herself through the front door of her modest Portland, Oregon home, the weight of a long day at the law firm clinging to her like the damp January chill of 2020. Her body ached, not just from hours spent poring over legal documents, but from the heaviness of her pregnancy, now in its final days. She set her bag on the kitchen counter, her mind swirling with thoughts of the nursery she and Kendrick had prepared, its walls painted a soft blue for the son they awaited. Dinner was a quick affair, a reheated plate of leftovers as her energy waned. She sank into the couch, rubbing her swollen belly, feeling the baby's gentle kicks, a reminder of the life soon to arrive. But as midnight approached, a sharp pain sliced through her, signaling the onset of labor. She woke Kendrick, his calm presence steadying her as they grabbed the hospital bag and rushed to Portland General Hospital under a starless sky. The labor was grueling, hours of contractions blurring into a haze of pain and anticipation. Nurses moved efficiently around her, their faces professional but distant, as machines beeped in the sterile delivery room. When the moment finally came, Latanya pushed with all her strength, her body trembling with effort. The room filled with the sounds of medical staff, but one sound was conspicuously absent. Her newborn son, named Elijah, did not cry. The silence was jarring, a void where she had expected the piercing wail of new life. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a clipped demeanor, handed the baby to a nurse who wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in Latanya's arms. His eyes, wide and unblinking, met hers, but his stillness unnerved her. She searched his tiny face, expecting familiarity, but found none. His features, small nose, delicate lips, seemed foreign, unlike her own or Kendrick's. The medical team assured her everything was fine. They ran tests checking Elijah's hearing, his vocal cords, his vital signs. The results came back normal, with no explanation for his silence. Her smile tight suggested some babies were simply quiet, but her avoidance of Latanya's questions felt deliberate. Latanya held Elijah close, her joy at his arrival tainted by a creeping unease. His gaze, distant and almost detached, stirred a primal instinct within her, a whisper that something was wrong. She studied him in the hospital's harsh fluorescent light, noting the shape of his eyes, the curve of his cheeks, searching for a connection that refused to form. Kendrick, sitting beside her, beamed with pride, oblivious to her growing disquiet. He reached for Elijah, cradling him gently, but Latanya's hands lingered, reluctant to let go. Back home, the first night was sleepless. Elijah lay in his crib, silent as ever, his breathing steady but his lack of sound deafening. Latanya sat by the crib watching him, her mind replaying the delivery room. The nurse's evasive glances, the doctor's hurried assurances, the absence of her son's cry, all gnawed at her. She tried to dismiss her doubts, chalking them up to the exhaustion of new motherhood, the hormonal fog that clouded her thoughts. Yet, as she traced her finger along Elijah's cheek, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was a stranger. The hospital bracelet on her wrist, still bearing his name, felt like a lie. She tucked it away in a drawer, unwilling to confront the suspicion taking root. This child might not be hers. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the nursery window, Latanya resolved to push the thought aside, but the seed of doubt had been planted, its roots already spreading through her weary mind. 3 months had passed since Elijah's birth, and the quiet of the Portland, Oregon home Latanya shared with Kendrick had taken on an unsettling quality. Elijah grew steadily, his small body filling out, his eyes bright and alert, but his silence persisted. He did not coo during playtime, nor did he whimper when hungry or startled. The absence of sound, once a curiosity, had become a haunting presence in Latanya's life. She spent her days tending to him, changing diapers, feeding him, rocking him to sleep, all while a nagging doubt festered. She wanted to be the devoted mother she had always imagined, but each time she looked into Elijah's face, she saw features that felt alien. His narrow nose, his deep-set eyes, the shape of his mouth bore no resemblance to her own or Kendrick's. The disconnect gnawed at her, a quiet ache that grew with each passing day. Latanya began to scrutinize Elijah more closely, her gaze lingering on his features as he lay in his crib or sat in his high chair. She pulled out old photo albums from her own childhood, stored in a box in the attic, hoping to find some trace of herself in him. The faded pictures showed her as a baby with round cheeks and a familiar smile, but Elijah's face held no echo of those traits. She studied Kendrick's family photos too, searching for any hint of his strong jawline or broad forehead, but found nothing. The lack of resemblance fueled her unease, turning her initial suspicions into a persistent question she couldn't silence. Kendrick noticed her preoccupation, her distracted stares as she held Elijah, but attributed it to the exhaustion of new parenthood. He urged her to rest, to focus on their new life as a family, his voice gentle but firm. Latanya nodded, forcing a smile, but hid the depth of her doubts, unwilling to burden him without proof. Determined to find answers, Latanya turned to the hospital records from Elijah's birth. She requested copies from Portland General Hospital, claiming it was for personal documentation, and spent late nights at the kitchen table, poring over the paperwork. The documents listed routine details, her admission time, the delivery process, Elijah's weight and length, but small inconsistencies caught her eye. A nurse's signature appeared in 2 different styles, and the timestamp on one form didn't align with her memory of the night. The discrepancies were subtle, easily dismissed as clerical errors, but they deepened her mistrust. She began to wonder if something had gone wrong in the chaos of the delivery room, if the child she held was truly hers. Latanya's search for clarity led her to order a DNA test from a private laboratory, a decision she made in secret. One quiet afternoon, while Kendrick was at work teaching history at a local high school, she carefully swabbed the inside of Elijah's cheek as he slept, then her own. She sealed the samples in the kit, her hands trembling as she filled out the forms and mailed them from a post office across town, ensuring Kendrick wouldn't see the package. The wait for results stretched before her, 2 weeks that felt like an eternity. To fill the time, she turned to the internet, her laptop glowing late into the night as she scoured forums and articles about hospital mix-ups and adoption scandals. She found stories of infants switched at birth, of parents discovering decades later that their children were not biologically theirs. Each account intensified her fear, her suspicion that Elijah's silence was not just a quirk, but a sign of a deeper truth. Her days became a balancing act of motherhood and investigation. She smiled for Kendrick, played with Elijah, and kept up her work at the law firm, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She kept a notebook hidden in her desk, filled with scribbled notes about the hospital, the inconsistencies in the records, and questions about Elijah's silence. She avoided looking at him too long, afraid her doubts would cloud the love she was trying to nurture. Yet as she rocked him to sleep, his silent gaze met hers, and the question lingered. Was he hers? The weight of that uncertainty grew, transforming her quiet suspicion into an obsession that consumed her every waking moment, driving her toward a truth she both craved and feared. The DNA test results arrived on a rainy April morning in 2020, delivered in a plain envelope that Latanya retrieved from the mailbox of her Portland, Oregon home with a racing heart. She waited until Kendrick left for work, his car disappearing down the wet street, before retreating to the bathroom, the only place she could ensure privacy. Locking the door, she tore open the envelope, her fingers clumsy with anticipation. The single sheet inside detailed the genetic analysis, its clinical language stark. Elijah was not her biological son. The data showed no maternal match between her DNA and his, a truth that hit like a physical blow. She sank to the floor, the cold tiles pressing against her knees as the room seemed to shrink around her. Her hands clutched the paper, her eyes scanning the results again and again, hoping for a mistake, but the numbers were undeniable. The child she had nursed, rocked, and loved for 3 months was not hers. Latanya's mind reeled, the silence of the house amplifying her shock. She thought of Elijah, asleep in his crib, his quiet presence now a source of pain rather than wonder. She hid the results in a zippered pocket of her purse, unwilling to let Kendrick see them, dreading his reaction to a truth she could barely process herself. The weight of the revelation drove her to action, her legal training kicking in as she resolved to uncover how this had happened. She turned to her laptop, her fingers trembling as she searched for answers. Typing Portland General Hospital 2020 into a search engine, she stumbled upon a local news archive mentioning a death in the maternity ward on the same day as her delivery. The article was brief, a somber note about Sheila Thompson, a 27-year-old woman who had died shortly after giving birth. Her death ruled a suicide. The name struck a chord, unfamiliar yet heavy with significance. Latanya dug deeper, her late-night searches revealing a digital obituary from a Portland newspaper. Sheila Thompson was described as a solitary figure, with no family mentioned, her life summarized in a few lines that ended with her tragic death in January 2020. A grainy photograph accompanied the obituary, showing a young woman with deep-set eyes and a weary expression. Latanya's breath caught as she studied the image. Sheila's eyes mirrored Elijah's, the same shape and intensity she had noticed but couldn't place. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable, a clue that turned her suspicion into a near certainty. Elijah was Sheila's child, not hers. The thought of a hospital mix-up or something more deliberate sent a chill through her. She saved the obituary and photo, her mind racing with questions about what had happened that night in the hospital. Determined to uncover the truth, Latanya contacted a private detective recommended by a colleague at the law firm. She found Marcus Reed, a former police officer turned investigator known for his discretion. She emailed him the hospital records, the DNA results, and her notes about Sheila, requesting a meeting. They met at a small cafe in downtown Portland, where Latanya handed over copies of her findings. Marcus, his face impassive, promised to look into the hospital's records and any staff involved in her delivery. Latanya felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by fear. The idea that Elijah had been deliberately given to her, that her motherhood was built on a lie, was almost too much to bear. She returned home, her purse heavier with the hidden results, her heart heavier still. Each day, Latanya went through the motions of caring for Elijah, feeding him, changing him, singing lullabies he didn't respond to. His silence, once a curiosity, now felt like a confirmation of her fears. She avoided looking too long into his eyes, afraid of seeing Sheila's gaze staring back. At night, she lay awake beside Kendrick, who slept unaware of the truth she carried. She pored over the hospital documents again, noting the same inconsistencies she had found before. Mismatched signatures, a timestamp that seemed off by hours. Her searches online grew more frantic, pulling up stories of hospital errors and rare cases of intentional child swaps. The more she learned, the more her obsession grew, a relentless need to understand why Elijah was in her arms and what had become of her own child, if one even existed. The truth was out there, and she would find it, no matter the cost to her heart or her family. Marcus Reed, the private detective Latanya had hired, worked tirelessly through the spring of 2020. His investigation into Portland General Hospital's records, peeling back layers of deception that had been buried since the night of Elijah's birth. He spent long hours in the archives of Portland, Oregon, sifting through faded hospital logs, cross-referencing staff schedules, and tracking down former employees who had worked in the maternity ward in January 2020. His calls to Latanya came late at night, each update a step closer to unraveling the mystery. By early May, he had uncovered a disturbing truth, one he presented to her in a quiet park near the Willamette River, handing her a slim folder of documents under the shade of a budding maple tree. Latanya sat on a weathered bench, the cool breeze carrying the scent of damp earth. As she opened the folder, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. The report detailed a clandestine network that had operated within the hospital, orchestrating illegal adoptions for profit. The scheme preyed on vulnerable women, offering them financial relief in exchange for their newborns, who were then placed with families willing to pay. Sheila Thompson, Elijah's biological mother, had been one such woman. A 27-year-old artist struggling with unemployment and mounting debts, Sheila had been approached by an intermediary days before her due date. Desperate and alone, she had agreed to relinquish her child for a substantial sum, signing papers in a hospital room under the guise of routine medical forms. Marcus had found a copy of the agreement buried in an obscure file, its language vague but damning. Sheila had given birth to a healthy boy, Elijah, on January 15th, 2020. But hours later, overwhelmed by guilt and despair, she had taken her own life in a hospital bathroom using a hidden stash of pills. The hospital had quickly classified her death as a suicide, closing the case with minimal investigation to avoid drawing attention. Marcus's findings revealed that Elijah had been transferred to Latanya through a carefully orchestrated exchange. The hospital records, which Latanya had noticed contained inconsistencies, had been deliberately falsified. Signatures were forged, timestamps altered, and delivery logs manipulated to list Latanya as Elijah's mother. A retired nurse, contacted by Marcus under the promise of anonymity, had admitted to witnessing suspicious activity that night. Nurses moving newborns between rooms under the pretense of routine checks, administrators whispering in hushed tones. The network, she hinted, had operated for years, exploiting women in crisis and capitalizing on the desperation of families seeking children. Latanya's mind reeled as she read the report, her fingers tracing the photocopied documents, each page a confirmation of the betrayal she had feared. Elijah, the silent child she had cradled for months, was Sheila's son, given to her through a transaction cloaked in secrecy. The weight of the truth settled over Latanya like a storm cloud. She felt a surge of anger toward the hospital, its staff complicit in a scheme that had stolen a mother's child and left another to die in despair. But her rage turned inward as well, a sharp sting of guilt for not noticing the signs sooner, the inconsistencies in the records, Elijah's silence, his unfamiliar features. She had held him, fed him, loved him, yet failed to see that he wasn't hers. The realization was a wound, cutting through the bond she had tried to build. She sat in the park long after Marcus left, the folder heavy in her lap, her thoughts spiraling. She thought of Sheila, a woman she had never met, whose pain had led to such a desperate choice. The photograph of Sheila, saved from the obituary, flashed in her mind. Those eyes, so like Elijah's, haunted her. Latanya resolved to take the evidence to the police, determined to expose the network and seek justice for Sheila. She gathered the documents, her notes and Marcus's report, preparing to visit the Portland Police Bureau. The decision was not without fear. She knew the truth could unravel her family, straining her marriage to Kendrick, who remained unaware of the depths of her discovery. She hid the folder in a locked drawer at home, unable to face him with the news just yet. Her anger and guilt churned, but so did a fierce resolve to hold the hospital accountable, to give voice to Sheila's silenced tragedy. As she drove home through Portland's rain-slicked streets, the city's lights blurred before her eyes, a reflection of the storm within her, pushing her toward a confrontation that would change everything. Latanya's decision to take Marcus Reed's findings to the Portland Police Bureau in May 2020 marked the beginning of a storm she hadn't anticipated. She met with a detective at the Bureau's headquarters in Portland, Oregon, handing over the folder of evidence, falsified hospital records, the DNA results, and Marcus's detailed report on the illegal adoption network. The detective, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, promised a thorough investigation, noting that the allegations against Portland General Hospital were serious. Within days, the case leaked to the local media, sparked by an anonymous tip. A reporter from the Oregonian published a front-page story detailing Latanya's discovery that her son Elijah was not biologically hers and alleging a decades-long scheme of illicit adoptions. The article, restrained but provocative, ignited public curiosity, and social media platforms buzzed with speculation about the hospital's practices. Local news channels ran segments, interviewing former patients who questioned their own children's origins, amplifying the scandal's reach. The story's spread brought a flood of attention to Latanya's quiet life. Her inbox filled with emails from strangers, some offering support, others sharing eerily similar stories of suspect adoptions at Portland General. A woman from Salem claimed her birth records contained unexplained gaps, while a couple from Eugene reported a mysterious payment tied to their adoption in the early 2000s. The growing number of accounts suggested the network's reach was far broader than Latanya had imagined, implicating not just her case but dozens of families across Oregon. An advocacy group, formed to demand accountability from the hospital, reached out to Latanya, urging her to become their spokesperson. Though overwhelmed, she agreed, driven by a sense of obligation to those whose lives had been altered by the same deception. The group organized a press conference at a downtown Portland community center, and Latanya found herself standing before a sea of reporters, cameras flashing as she recounted her journey, from Elijah's silent birth to the devastating DNA results and the truth about Sheila Thompson's suicide. Her hands gripped the podium, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest as she called for justice. The press conference, broadcast live on regional news, drew national attention. Outlets like NPR and the New York Times picked up the story, framing LaTanya as a symbol of resilience against institutional betrayal. But the spotlight came with a price. Online, she faced a barrage of criticism. Comment sections and social media posts accused her of ingratitude, arguing that she should be thankful for a healthy child and a stable life. Others questioned her motives, labeling her story a fabrication for fame. The attacks stung, each one a reminder of the love she had once felt for Elijah, now clouded by the truth of his origins. LaTanya spent nights reading the comments, her heart torn between defiance and doubt. She questioned whether exposing the truth had been worth the public dissection of her life, whether her fight was helping others or merely deepening her own pain. Kendrick, who had learned the full truth after LaTanya's meeting with the police, became her anchor. She had shown him the DNA results and Marcus's report, watching his face crumple as the reality sank in. Though shaken, he stood by her, attending advocacy meetings and shielding her from the harshest media inquiries. He reminded her that her courage had given others hope, but the strain was palpable. Their marriage, once a source of comfort, began to fray under the weight of her obsession. Evenings that had been spent cooking together or playing with Elijah were now consumed by strategy sessions with the advocacy group or interviews with journalists. LaTanya's focus on the investigation left little room for their relationship, and Kendrick's quiet attempts to reconnect, a hand on her shoulder, a suggestion for a night out, went unanswered. She noticed the distance in his eyes, the way his laughter had faded, but felt powerless to bridge the gap. Her bond with Elijah grew even more complex. She cared for him daily, his silent presence a constant reminder of Sheila's sacrifice. Yet, knowing he was not her biological son, LaTanya struggled to reconcile her love with her sense of betrayal. She watched him play, his eyes so like Sheila's, following her movements, and wondered if she could ever fully embrace him as her own. The advocacy work, while empowering, deepened her inner turmoil. Meetings with other affected families revealed shared stories of loss and confusion, but also highlighted her unique struggle. Elijah's silence, a trait no one else reported, set him apart, making her question whether it was a sign of his origins or something deeper. As the investigation gained momentum, LaTanya felt herself drifting, caught between her role as a public figure and the private pain of a mother whose child felt like a stranger. The storm of public attention had given her a platform, but it had also left her questioning who she was and whether she could find a way to love the child at the heart of it all. By the summer of 2020, the investigation into Portland General Hospital's illegal adoption network had yielded partial results, but justice remained elusive. The Portland Police Bureau, acting on LaTanya's evidence, arrested 2 nurses and a low-level administrator, their roles in the scheme confirmed by falsified records and witness accounts. Yet the masterminds, those who had orchestrated the operation, slipped through the cracks, protected by expired statutes of limitations and a lack of direct evidence. LaTanya attended the court hearings in Portland, Oregon, sitting in the back of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the defendants, who showed little remorse. The legal roadblocks left her drained, the months of public battles and personal turmoil eroding her resolve. She felt the weight of her fight, not just for herself, but for the others who had come forward, their stories echoing her own. The partial victories felt hollow, and she knew she needed to find closure beyond the courtroom. Seeking a connection to the woman at the heart of her story, LaTanya visited Sheila Thompson's grave in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Portland. The July sun beat down as she walked through rows of weathered headstones, clutching a single white rose. Sheila's marker was simple, engraved with her name and dates, 1993 to 2020. LaTanya knelt in the dry grass, placing the rose on the stone, her fingers lingering as she traced the letters. She closed her eyes, imagining Sheila's final moments, the despair that had driven her to such an irreversible act. The silence of the cemetery mirrored Elijah's, a quiet that now felt less like a mystery and more like a bridge to the mother she had never known. She sat there for hours, the solitude offering a space to grieve for Sheila's lost dreams and the child they had both loved in different ways. Determined to understand Sheila beyond her tragedy, Latanya visited the Portland Historical Society, where a volunteer mentioned Sheila's past as a singer. The society had preserved a recording from a local open mic night in 2019, a rare glimpse into Sheila's life. Latanya listened to the grainy audio through headphones in a quiet archive room, the melody haunting and raw, filled with longing and a fragile hope. Sheila's voice, rich and soulful, sang of love and loss, each note a testament to a life cut short by poverty and desperation. The song, titled Tomorrow's Light, struck Latanya deeply. She saw in it Sheila's wish for a better future for her child, a wish that had led to Elijah's placement with her. The discovery shifted her perspective, transforming Elijah's silence from a source of alienation to a poignant link to Sheila's spirit. Back home, Latanya watched Elijah sleep in his crib, his silent breath steady in the dim light of the nursery. She studied his face, seeing Sheila's eyes in his, and felt a surge of love tangled with pain. The truth of his origins had fractured her sense of motherhood, yet she couldn't deny the bond they had built over months of care. But the weight of the truth, coupled with the strain on her marriage to Kendrick, became unbearable. Kendrick had stood by her through the investigation, his support unwavering, but their connection had frayed. Latanya's focus on the case had left little room for their shared life, and she saw the hurt in his eyes each time she prioritized her fight over their family. After weeks of reflection, she made the heart-wrenching decision to leave Portland, seeking a fresh start to untangle her identity and heal. She chose Seattle, a city close enough to return but far enough to feel like a new beginning. On her final night in Portland, Latanya packed a small suitcase, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed Sheila's obituary photo and a digital print of the song's lyrics on the living room table, beside a single candle. Lighting it, she watched the flame flicker, casting shadows across the room. Tears fell as she looked at the photo, Sheila's face a reminder of a sacrifice she could now honour but not fully understand. She thought of Elijah, asleep upstairs, and Kendrick, who had agreed to care for him during her absence. Her departure was not a rejection of them, but an act of love, a way to protect Elijah from her inner turmoil. As she blew out the candle, the smoke rising in the dark, Latanya felt her heart break, gratitude for the child she had raised, sorrow for Sheila's loss, and a fragile hope for her own redemption. She stepped into the night, leaving behind the life she had known, carrying the echoes of both mothers into an uncertain future.